There is a stage beyond rationalization, a stage where people no longer explain why a bad decision makes sense, because they've stopped believing that good decisions exist at all, not in theory, but in practice. This is the moment when a system causes its deepest damage, not by forcing people to choose badly, but by teaching them that choosing no longer matters. In the previous video, we talked about defensive rationalization, how people cope when systems remove good options, how bad decisions start to feel reasonable. But rationalization still assumes something important. It assumes choice. It assumes that if conditions improved, if rules changed, if effort finally paid off, people would respond. Learned helplessness begins when that assumption disappears. Learned helplessness is not apathy. It's not laziness. It's not giving up. It's what happens after sustained effort fails often enough that the mind stops expecting improvement. Not because people don't care, but because caring becomes expensive. At first, people try, they plan, they calculate, they delay gratification. They believe that if they make enough correct decisions, the outcome will eventually make sense. This belief is not naive. It's how functional systems are supposed to work. But when effort repeatedly fails to change outcomes, something shifts. People don't panic, they adjust, they try again, they rationalize, and they cope. But over time, another change occurs. People stop projecting forward. They don't say, "I'll get there eventually." They say, "It's never going to happen." They don't ask, "What's the best decision?" They ask, "Why bother deciding?" And that shift is not emotional, it's adaptive. The human brain is designed to learn from patterns. When actions produce feedback, we refine our behavior. When actions produce nothing but resistance, we conserve energy. Learned helplessness is not despair, it's efficiency in an unresponsive environment. This is why people experiencing learned helplessness often appear calm. They still work, they still show up, they still function. But internally, expectations have collapsed. The future stops being a place where effort produces progress. It becomes a place you don't emotionally invest in at all. And when people stop investing in the future, they don't stop living. They stop believing. The first thing people lose is not motivation, it's planning. Not day-to-day planning. That still exists. Pay this bill, renew that lease, get through this month. What disappears is long-term planning. The kind of thinking that assumes your actions today will meaningfully shape your life years from now. In healthy systems, planning is almost automatic. People think in sequences. If I work here for a few years, I'll gain leverage. If I save consistently, I'll gain independence. If I delay gratification now, I'll gain freedom later. The exact outcome is uncertain, but the direction makes sense. Effort creates options. Learned helplessness begins when that logic breaks, not once, not suddenly, but repeatedly. People do what they're supposed to do, and nothing opens up. They save. Prices move faster. They gain experience. Costs absorb it. They wait patiently. The timeline stretches again and again. At first, people respond by recalculating. Maybe I need to save more. Maybe I need to wait longer. Maybe I need to compromise. This is still healthy behavior. This is adaptation. But when recalculation never produces a different outcome, the brain updates its model. Instead of asking, "What should I plan for?" people start asking, "How far ahead is it safe to think?" And the answer keeps shrinking. 5 years becomes 2. 2 years becomes 1. Eventually, planning collapses into pure maintenance. This is why learned helplessness doesn't feel dramatic, it feels practical. People say things like, "I don't think that far ahead anymore. Plans don't really mean much now. I'll see how things look later." These sound flexible, but they're defensive. They protect you from the emotional cost of investing in futures that never arrive. When long-term planning disappears, ambition quietly follows. Not because people want less, but because ambition without belief feels irresponsible. Why plan a family if stability is unpredictable? Why plan a career shift if error margins are gone? Why plan ownership If timelines keep dissolving, this is how people become present-focused, without becoming reckless. They don't chase pleasure, they don't give up control, they simply stop projecting. The future becomes abstract, detached, emotionally neutral. And this is the critical shift. A society can survive without optimism, but it cannot progress without planning. Because progress requires people to commit effort now for outcomes they cannot yet see. Once that commitment disappears, systems don't collapse. They stall. People are still busy, still productive on paper, still contributing, but they're no longer building trajectories, they're managing exposure. And managing exposure is not the same as building a life. When planning collapses at scale, the damage doesn't show up immediately. It appears years later, as stagnation, as risk aversion, as a shortage of new ideas, as a generation that feels cautious, without knowing why. Learned helplessness doesn't begin. When people stop working, it begins. When people stop imagining futures worth working toward. When long-term planning collapses, something else disappears soon after. Experimentation. People stop testing the system, not because they're afraid, not because they lack ideas, but because experience taught them that outcomes don't respond. In a responsive system, people constantly test boundaries. They try new roles. They move cities. They switch industries. They start small projects just to see what happens. Each action is a question. If I do this, does the system react differently? Progress depends on that feedback loop. Learned helplessness breaks the loop. After enough failed signals, the brain stops sending them. Not consciously, automatically. People still make choices, but they stop expecting variation. Different actions start to feel interchangeable. No matter what you do, the result looks the same. Higher costs, longer timelines, narrower margins. When choices stop producing meaningfully different outcomes, choice itself loses value. So people simplify. They choose the safest option and stay inside it, not because it's optimal, because it's predictable. This is why learned helplessness often looks like prudence. From the outside, people seem cautious. They avoid risk. They avoid disruption. They avoid instability. But internally, something else is happening. They no longer trust the system to reward initiative. They no longer believe that trying harder or differently will change the result. This is the point where innovation quietly dies, not because ideas disappear, but because belief disappears. Why test a new path? If every path feels capped, why invest effort? If effort only maintains position, why take risk? If downside is permanent and upside is hypothetical, so people stop pushing, they stop applying pressure, they stop asking questions that might expose how unresponsive the system has become. They build routines instead. Routines feel safe because they don't promise anything. They don't disappoint. This is how stagnation becomes invisible. Nothing breaks. People don't quit en masse. They don't revolt. They don't panic. They simply stop experimenting. And without experimentation, systems don't evolve. They just persist. At scale, this changes everything. Career mobility slows. Entrepreneurship declines. Geographic movement drops. Not because people are lazy, but because the expected return on trying something new fell below zero. Learned helplessness doesn't remove effort, it redirects it. Effort goes into preservation, not expansion, into managing risk, not creating opportunity, into avoiding loss, not building gain. And once a society reaches this stage, progress becomes accidental. It happens only when conditions change, by external force, not because people inside the system are still pushing for it. This is the moment when a system stops being dynamic and becomes brittle. Because systems that are not tested do not adapt. They only hold until they can't. Learned helplessness doesn't stay personal. It spreads. Not through policy, not through headlines, through advice. This is how it moves, from one generation to the next. Parents don't tell their children to aim higher anymore. They tell them to be careful. They don't say, build something better than we had. They say, don't take risks you can't afford. Not because they want less, for their children, but because they've learned how expensive disappointment can be. Teachers adjust too, not because they're cynical, but because they're practical. They emphasize stability over exploration, certainty over possibility, credentials over curiosity. They prepare students for a system they believe won't bend, not one that might respond to effort or imagination. Peers reinforce it. Friends don't ask, "What do you want to build?" They ask, "What's safe right now?" They don't celebrate ambition. They warn against it, not out of jealousy, out of fear. This is how learned helplessness becomes culture. It stops sounding like despair and starts sounding like wisdom. Don't expect too much. Keep your head down. That's just how it works. And once those phrases become normal, the system no longer needs to convince anyone. People do the work themselves. This is where the damage compounds, because young people don't experience failure and then recover. They inherit avoidance. They don't test limits because they were taught limits don't move. They don't experiment because experimentation was framed as irresponsibility. Over time, this creates a strange inversion. Those with the most talent become the most cautious. Those who could push boundaries choose not to, not because they lack courage, but because they lack belief that the system will respond fairly. This is how societies lose momentum without losing intelligence. The capacity is still there. The skills are still there. What's missing is the expectation. That effort will translate into progress. When learned helplessness becomes generational, policy fixes lose power. Because even when conditions improve, behavior doesn't immediately follow. People don't trust improvement. They wait to see if it lasts. And waiting delays recovery, sometimes for decades. This is why some societies remain stagnant. Long after the original constraints are gone, the system changed, but the psychology didn't. People still behave as if the old limits apply. And that's the hardest part to reverse. Not prices, not wages, not regulations. Belief. Once belief is broken at scale, it doesn't come back on command. It has to be rebuilt slowly, through visible, repeated proof. That effort matters again. Until that happens, people will remain rational. They will stay cautious. They will limit ambition. They will avoid testing the system, not because they're weak, but because the system trained them well. And this brings us to the final question. What happens when a system survives by relying on resignation, when stability is maintained, by keeping people inside choices they no longer believe in? There is a final stage. To learned helplessness, it's not collapse, it's resignation. Resignation is when people no longer believe. That effort will meaningfully change outcomes, but continue participating anyway. They work, they pay, they comply, not because they expect progress, but because stopping would hurt faster. From the outside, this looks like stability. Markets function, institutions remain intact. Daily life continues, but internally, the system has crossed a dangerous threshold. It no longer relies on belief, it runs on exhaustion. This is the most brittle state a system can enter, not because it's weak, but because it's untested. People aren't pushing against limits anymore. They aren't probing for opportunities. They aren't experimenting. They're minimizing exposure. And systems that are never tested don't adapt. They just hold shape until pressure comes from somewhere else. This is why resignation is more dangerous than anger ever was. Anger still believes something should change. Resignation assumes nothing will. Anger creates friction. Resignation creates silence. And silence is easy to misread as consent. When systems confuse resignation for stability, they stop improving. They protect existing structures. Instead of renewing them, they optimize for maintenance instead of progress. And over time, the maintenance becomes the entire economy. Preserving assets, preserving narratives, preserving the appearance of normality, while human potential quietly expires underneath. This is not how societies fail loudly. This is how they age, slowly, quietly, with fewer risks taken each year, with fewer futures imagined, with fewer people believing. That effort will ever open new doors Learned helplessness is not the end, but it is the point where recovery becomes difficult because recovery requires belief before it produces results. And belief is the first thing people lose when systems stop responding. To reverse this state, it's not enough to adjust policy. It's not enough to change incentives on paper. People need visible proof, repeated proof. That effort compounds again, that risk is survivable, that planning is worth it. Until then, people will remain rational. They will keep choosing safety. They will keep shrinking horizons. They will keep living inside systems they no longer trust. And this is where the series goes next. Because in the next video, we'll look at what happens when systems learn to survive. By trapping people inside resignation, when stability is maintained, not by opportunity, but by the absence of alternatives. If this helped you understand why people stop planning futures, instead of chasing them, subscribe. Not for outrage, not for answers, but for clarity. Because once you can see how a system shapes behavior, you get to decide how much of your life you're willing to organize around it.